The sun was falling behind the red hills, painting the dry land with gold and soft shadows. The lonely rancher named Ethan Cole walked back toward his small house at the edge of the desert. He was a quiet man, with a rough beard and eyes that looked like they had seen too many empty sunsets. Years of hard work had built his body strong, but his heart had grown tired. He lived alone on his land since his parents had passed away, keeping himself busy with cattle, fences, and the sound of the wind that never stopped whispering through the open plain. Every evening, after feeding his horses, he would stand by the corral and watch the valley beyond. Sometimes he saw dust in the distance, riders from the Apache village that lay beyond the ridge. He never went near them, not because he feared them, but because he respected them. The land had belonged to their people long before his ranch ever stood there. But one day in late summer, everything changed. Ethan was riding back from the river with a bundle of feed when he saw a young woman standing near the old cottonwood tree. She was barefoot, wearing a faded brown dress that brushed the sand. Her hair was long and dark like the night sky, and her eyes looked away the moment he noticed her. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked down as if she didn't want to be seen. Ethan slowed his horse and stopped a few yards away. "You lost?" he asked softly. The woman didn't answer. She turned her head slightly, her dark braids falling over her shoulder, and he saw the marks of tears on her cheeks. She wasn't lost, she was running from something, though he couldn't tell what. He didn't move closer. He knew enough about pride and silence to understand that some people needed time before they spoke. "If you need water," he said gently, "there's a well back at my place. You can fill a jar and go. Nobody'll bother you." Still no answer. She stood quiet, watching the horizon instead of him. The only sound was the wind. Ethan finally nodded and started to ride away, but before he could go far, he heard a small voice behind him. "My name is Naya," she said, barely louder than the breeze. He stopped his horse. "All right, Naya," he said. "You're welcome to rest at my place if you need it." She didn't move until he started back toward the ranch, then followed slowly, walking behind him without another word. At the ranch, Ethan poured her a cup of water and set out a clean blanket near the porch. He didn't ask her why she was alone or where her people were. Some questions didn't need to be spoken on the first day. She drank the water, nodded politely, and sat by the steps. He saw her glancing at the open land beyond his fence, as if she was still ready to run. The night came softly, with the sound of crickets and the cry of a lone coyote far away. Ethan lit a lantern and stayed on the porch, giving her space. When he offered her some bread and beans, she accepted, but still didn't look at him. She kept her eyes low, her voice quiet. He noticed she flinched at loud sounds. Even the creak of the wooden step made her tense. He didn't press her with questions. Instead, he spoke about simple things. How the cattle were restless in the heat, how the creek had run low that season. She didn't answer, but he saw her listening. Sometimes her lips moved as if she wanted to speak, but then she stopped herself. When the moon rose, she wrapped herself in the blanket and slept by the porch rail. Ethan stayed awake a while longer, staring at the stars. He wondered what had brought her to him. He knew she wasn't just a traveler. There was a story behind those quiet eyes. But he decided he would wait. Time had a way of revealing what words couldn't. The next morning, Ethan found her awake early, feeding the chickens as if she had lived there her whole life. She didn't look at him, but she worked silently, careful and graceful. When he offered her coffee, she shook her head. He smiled anyway and poured her some warm milk instead. Days passed and the same quiet rhythm continued. She stayed near the ranch, helped with small chores, never asking for anything. Ethan began to grow used to her presence, the sound of her footsteps, the sight of her figure in the morning light. She was like a part of the land itself, silent, strong, mysterious. But she still wouldn't look at him. Not once. When he spoke to her, she listened but turned her face away. At first, he thought she was shy, but there was more to it than that. It was as if looking at him would mean admitting something she wasn't ready for. One evening, while repairing a broken fence, he saw her standing near the barn, watching the horses. The sunset turned her skin golden and the wind played with her hair. She looked peaceful for the first time. Ethan leaned on the fence and said softly, "They like you. Horses don't trust just anyone." She didn't answer, but he saw a small smile appear and disappear just as quickly. He took a breath and said, You don't have to stay here if you don't want to, but if you do, you don't have to explain anything either." For a long time, she was silent. Then she said, "You don't ask me who I am." Ethan shook his head. "You'll tell me when you're ready." She turned slightly, not to face him fully, but enough that the fading light touched her eyes. "No one ever said that before," she whispered. He smiled faintly. Then maybe they should have. After that night, something changed. She began to hum while working, a low tune that drifted through the ranch like a forgotten lullaby. She started leaving small signs of trust. A folded blanket on his chair, a fixed button on his shirt, a warm cup of tea waiting by the door. But she still didn't meet his gaze. Not yet. One afternoon, Ethan rode out to check the cattle and found her sitting by the creek, her feet in the cool water. She didn't notice him at first. Her hair was loose, her eyes half closed as if she was thinking of another world. When she realized he was there, she quickly looked away. Ethan got off his horse and sat on a rock nearby, keeping a respectful distance. "This place helps, doesn't it?" he said. "The water, the sound of it, makes things quiet inside." She nodded, her eyes still on the water. "My father used to say the river remembers everything," she said softly. "But it never tells." "That's a good thing sometimes," Ethan said. For the first time she smiled, a small, shy smile like the first light after rain. He wanted to say more, but he didn't. He didn't want to scare the moment away. The sky grew soft with evening light. Ethan stood and brushed the dust from his hands. "I'll head back," he said. "Take your time. The ranch isn't going anywhere." She looked at him then, just for a second, just enough for their eyes to meet. There was fear, sadness, and something else he couldn't name. Before he could speak, she looked down again. That night, Ethan sat on the porch waiting. When she returned from the creek, she walked past him quietly, wrapped in her blanket. Before she went inside, she stopped and said in a quiet voice, "Thank you for waiting." He looked at her, wanting to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He only nodded, and as she stepped into the dim light of the small house, he realized that maybe some hearts needed time to trust the world again, and maybe waiting wasn't a burden, but a promise. The desert wind moved through the grass, carrying with it the quiet hope of something slowly beginning. The days grew cooler as autumn came to the valley. The cottonwood leaves turned yellow and danced across the dusty yard whenever the wind passed through. Ethan noticed that Naya had begun to move more freely around the ranch. She still spoke little, but her silence was softer now, not heavy like before. Sometimes he caught her humming while washing dishes or talking quietly to the horses as if they were old friends. Ethan didn't ask her to stay, and she didn't say she would. Yet every morning when he stepped out to feed the cattle, she was there, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, helping without a word. He began to see her not as a guest or stranger, but as someone who belonged, like the morning sun that always rose over the same ridge. One afternoon, he found her near the barn, brushing one of the horses. She looked calm, but her hands trembled slightly. He noticed and asked gently, "You all right?" She nodded, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "I dreamed again last night," she said. Ethan leaned on the fence and waited. "It was a fire," she said slowly, "and voices shouting. I ran, and I didn't look back. I left everything." He said nothing, knowing she wasn't ready to say more. When she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with a sadness he could feel deep inside his chest. "I can't go back," she said quietly. "Even if they forgave me, I wouldn't belong anymore." Ethan nodded. "Then you don't have to," he said. "You belong where you choose to be." For a long moment she stared at the ground. Then for the first time she met his eyes and didn't look away. It wasn't a long look, but it was steady, like she was finally ready to face the world again. After that, their days began to carry a different rhythm. They worked side by side, fixing fences, tending horses, gathering firewood. Ethan started teaching her how to read a few words from an old book he had kept from his mother. She was a quick learner and laughed softly whenever she made a mistake. He had never heard her laugh before. It was quiet but beautiful, like the sound of rain after months of dry wind. The more she laughed, the lighter the ranch began to feel. The house, once silent and empty, was now filled with the sound of footsteps and simple talk. Ethan found himself smiling more often without realizing it. He didn't dare to tell her what he felt. He was afraid it would break the fragile peace between them. But every time she looked at him, he felt something growing stronger, something that words couldn't hold. One evening, a storm rolled over the valley. Thunder echoed in the distance, and the wind howled across the open plains. Ethan hurried to close the barn doors while Naya brought the blankets inside. When the rain started falling hard, she stood by the window, watching the lightning light up the hills. Ethan joined her quietly. The thunder rumbled again, and she closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. "I used to be afraid of storms," she said softly. He glanced at her. "Not anymore?" She shook her head. "Not here." He didn't know what to say. He just watched her reflection in the window, her dark eyes calm, her hair falling over her shoulder. For the first time, she seemed at peace. When the storm passed, the air smelled clean and new. The ranch glistened with small puddles that caught the light of the rising moon. Naya stepped outside, barefoot again, feeling the wet earth under her feet. Ethan followed her to the porch, watching as she turned her face toward the sky. "This land," she said quietly, "it listens. It doesn't ask, it doesn't judge. It just lets you be." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's why I stayed here all these years." She looked at him again, her gaze soft. "Maybe that's why I was meant to find it," she said. For a moment, the silence between them felt alive, full of words that neither dared to say. Then she smiled faintly and went back inside. In the weeks that followed, their bond grew without needing many words. Sometimes she sang in her language while working, and Ethan would listen from a distance, not wanting to interrupt. Other times she would leave wildflowers on the porch rail, small and simple but always fresh. He knew they were meant for him, though she never said it. One morning, Ethan woke early and found her gone. Her blanket was folded neatly, her small bag missing. The yard was empty and the quiet felt heavy again. He walked to the ridge and saw no sign of her. He stood there a long time, feeling a slow ache in his chest. She had left without goodbye. He went back to his chores, though the hours passed without meaning. That evening, he sat on the porch where she used to sit, the same cup she used still resting by the step. The stars came out one by one, and he whispered to the night, "I told you I'd wait." Days turned into weeks. He didn't know if she'd ever come back, but he waited just as he promised. Every evening, he placed a lantern by the porch rail in case she ever found her way home after dark. The neighbors sometimes asked why he kept that light burning. He only smiled and said, "For someone who isn't lost anymore, just finding her way." Then one cold evening near winter, he heard the faint sound of a horse approaching. He stood up, his heart beating fast. A small figure rode slowly toward the house, wrapped in a brown shawl. When the horse stopped, she slid down carefully, her eyes meeting his across the yard. "Naya," he said softly. She didn't speak at first. The wind carried her hair across her face, and her hands trembled as she held the reins. Then she said, "You waited." He nodded, his voice thick. "I said I would." She stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "I went home," she said quietly. "They forgave me, but it wasn't the same. The land felt empty without you." Ethan didn't move. He was afraid to break the moment. She smiled faintly. "I told my father about you," she said. "He said a man who waits with patience has a true heart." Ethan's throat tightened. "I don't know about that," he said. "I just kept a light burning." Her eyes softened. She took a slow step closer. "Then maybe I followed that light." The silence between them was deep, filled with everything that didn't need to be said. She looked into his eyes, truly looked this time, and didn't look away. There was no fear now, no sadness, only quiet understanding. Ethan lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wished. She didn't. Her hand met his, warm and steady. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of the wind and the whisper of the desert. She said softly, "I'm ready now." He smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep inside, the kind that had been waiting for a long time. That night, they sat together on the porch, the lantern burning low, the stars watching quietly above them. Neither spoke much, they didn't need to. Some stories didn't end with big words or sudden turns. They ended softly, with peace in the heart and the feeling that something lost had finally been found. As the wind moved gently through the grass, Ethan reached over and held her hand again. The light from the lantern flickered between them, warm and steady, just like the promise he had made long ago. And this time, she didn't look away.